G'day.
Hi, how are you?
Oh, it's been one of those days, actually.
Has it? How come?
Oh, well, we had this Methanex thing coming out of the blue.
The Methanex thing that surprised even RNZ's business editor Giles Beckford is the latest development in the energy crisis. A crisis that's been branded an omni-shambles and the worst many in the industry have seen.
What we're seeing now are some really long-term drivers that if we don't fix them, the situation's just going to progressively get worse and worse and worse for years on end, not for sort of an hour or two on a particular day.
I'm Sharon Brett-Kelly, and today on The Detail, factories are closing, jobs are in jeopardy, and the country's reputation is shaky. The four big power companies, known as the gentailers, are being accused of excessive profits, and the government is threatening to pull them into line. So what's behind the electricity crunch, and how long will it last? So, Giles, can we kick off with this Methanex announcement? Because It's the biggest gas user in the country and it's shutting down its operations entirely for, at least a couple of months?
Yeah, till the end of October. It had been running at reduced capacity anyway because it couldn't get the gas that it needed to run the plants full tilt. It's almost in their interest, and they make the point saying, well, actually, we're going to earn more money from selling this gas to Contact and Genesis than we will have made from making methanol and selling it. For them, while they're seeming to be generous, coming to the country's aid, in essence, there's a cool commercial brain behind this, which says, look, we'll earn more from selling gas to you than actually making and selling methanol.
It's sort of an alarming sign, isn't it, that this big company that makes $800 million a year in exports temporarily shuts its factory down to help ease this energy crisis that we seem to be in.
Well, clearly, the decision makers and the various players have sat down behind closed doors and said, what deals can we cut? And in much the same way that the power companies have been talking to NZ Steel and have been talking to the Tiwai Point aluminium smelter, where they have clauses in the supply contracts there to require the smelter to cut back its production. So they've been able to work out a similar sort of deal with Methanex, saying, right, we need the gas for a short term. We'll pay a premium for it because you have to guess that that's essentially what they're doing. And that guarantees gas supply for Contact. They've got what they call a fast starter plant in Taranaki, gas fired. They can switch that on in a matter of minutes. They've now got the security, they're knowing that there'll be gas there. In the same way, Genesis says, thank you, we'll take a few petajoules of gas, and that means that we can fire up another one of our units at Huntly and have that going at full capacity. And into the bargain, Genesis, of course, is bringing in more coal to be able to fire up the big Rankine unit that they've got there. So Genesis will actually be running almost at full capacity, 5 turbines.
Gosh, and that's really Genesis. That Huntly power station is kind of seen as the backup, isn't it?
That is what provides the backbone of our power supplies. It's base load, as they call it. It just runs, it just chunters out the electricity. It provides enough power for more than 1 million households. And so from that point of view, that's a fair slice of the domestic market. But from their point of view, fuel supply is the key issue, and it's just a confluence of circumstances at the moment. Hydro lakes are about half of what they were a year ago.
We really are seeing some of the driest conditions we have seen since sometimes 1980s and sometimes the driest they have ever been. So it's quite unprecedented for us to be heading into summer with our rivers and our lakes at such a low level.
And into the bargain, what you would have expected from, say, wind farms, well, their contribution has been well diminished because the wind hasn't been blowing. So, everything comes together. And into the bargain, on top of that, demand is up around 3 or 4% this year on last year. So reduced supplies of fuel, increased demand, and that means that the power companies are scrambling to get the necessary generation there to meet everything.
As well as that, we're running out of gas.
But that's not a new issue. I mean, we've known for the past decade that our gas supplies were going to dwindle. I think the thing for gas in particular, though, is that just how stark that fall off in gas production is going to be, or was going to be, has come home realistically in the past couple of years, where, of course, hopes that we would find more gas, and they were, for instance, hoping that they'd get more out of the Kupe field. Well, that didn't work. We always knew gas was going to diminish, and we didn't have enthusiastic exploration, and Labour's ban on offshore exploration, which was brought in 2018, just compounded the nervousness of the explorers saying, well, why should we really go to New Zealand? I mean, New Zealand was never a favoured destination, and let's be quite clear about that. I mean, certainly the government makes political capital out of Labour's ban, but the reality was that, several $1 billion has been spent in the past 5 or 6 years drilling essentially dry holes, or attempts to get more gas out of the existing fields hasn't been as successful. From that point of view, it's 10 years to develop a gas field. They would have had a reasonable find in the mid-2010s to be producing more gas of any significant volumes now.
And all that adds up to record wholesale prices.
Yeah, when you're running at $1,000 per megawatt, as we were a week before last, and you've got Australia and others running at 50 to 100, we've got a problem.
That, in turn, leads to this.
The Panpac mill in Napier has stopped all pulp production, saying the cost of electricity means it's cheaper to shut down rather than produce at a loss. 3 other pulp and paper plants in the North Island have also temporarily closed down.
Fonterra says rising wholesale electricity prices and uncertainty in the gas market are adding significant cost to both the co-op and its shareholders, as it cannot simply pause operations.
John Harbord is the chair of the Major Electricity Users Group, which represents the big electricity customers. He warns it's not just our exporters that are hurting, it's the country's reputation.
If you look across, our large commercial and industrial manufacturers who use a lot of electricity, there's a very low confidence in sort of the market structures and market rules to deliver good outcomes for consumers. So alongside securing a really reliable supply of gas, and that could be some more exploration of existing fields, maybe we need to look to see if there are any other fields, maybe we need to import some gas. But alongside that, we need to actually restore confidence in the market settings, and I think that's crucially important as well, because that's what drives the outlook businesses have for the future. Do they have confidence that there's going to be a fairer, better price in the future? Or is the wholesale price going to keep tracking up? And that's actually what the futures market tells us, is that the wholesale electricity price is tracking up. Can we bend that back? Because we're aware of global companies who are declining to invest in New Zealand because they don't have confidence in our electricity system. So that's crucially important as well.
Really? So what companies are turning away?
Look, I'd rather not say.
But you know of some companies that
I know of at least 2.
And what are they saying to you?
Literally, they have very little confidence in our electricity system. The prices don't make sense to them, and they don't see a sort of a proactive, or they haven't seen, I should say, a proactive government or regulator looking to get on top of the issue.
Have you come across that ever before?
No, I think that's really a feature of the last few years.
So is this situation that we're in now, this crisis, because we do seem to have a few energy crises, we've had some over the years, but would this be the worst that you've known?
I would say yes, because I think what's different this time around is we're sort of talking about long-term drivers in the electricity system. Previously when we've had crises, we have, and not to downplay it, we have a short blackout in Auckland, or we get warnings that we're going to be potentially short of electricity for about an hour or so on a particular day. Now, they are short-term problems that the system has sort of flexibility built into it that you can sort of navigate your way through that. And I think it's actually just worth noting that, we have an incredibly reliable electricity system to the point where if we ever have an outage, we remember it for years and years. So I think it's much more critical that we get on top of this situation, even more so than problems we've had in the past.
So, Giles, what's wrong with the Electricity Authority as the regulator? I mean, Shane Jones has used that phrase, a chocolate teapot.
Sadly, that organisation has proven to be a chocolate teapot in regulating the excessive behaviour of the gentailers, who I feel are probably the most powerful economic institutions in New Zealand beyond the supermarkets and the Aussie banks.
Look, he's only the latest critic of the authority, and I think it's a case of the Electricity Authority being criticised for not being able to see, we won't say wood from trees, but perhaps the light bulbs from the power grids, from the pylons, because most certainly the authority, I think, is being regarded as being too focused on some of the smaller issues. It hasn't stood back. It hasn't taken what is regarded as a long-term and broad view of the market. In the times that it's been called on to act, I think it's been regarded as generally weak, its decisions insipid. It's forever reviewing things. I mean, we heard from them last week. We're going to drill down into the data even more to shed more light on power prices and why they're so exceptionally high.
Electricity Authority Chief Executive Sarah Gillies.
We are already using our powers to drill into why prices are so volatile and so high. We're not comfortable with just accepting industry explanations.
So what are you doing about that?
Well, we're using our regulatory powers to essentially put more sunlight on the system. So we're demanding quite specific information about pricing and behaviour in the market. We already monitor market behaviour, but we are stepping it up in this space.
Well, that sort of characterises the authority as being driven by data and study, but actually pretty weak on action. If you remember a couple of years ago, we had a high spike in wholesale prices. There was an accusation from some of the smaller retailers basically arguing that the big players had been manipulating the market and they were looking for action from the authority. The authority said at that stage, well, actually, there's no evidence here that we can see that the big power companies acted untoward, that they were feathering their own nests at the expense of other retailers or of consumers generally. And I think the view is that the authority really is just, it's dysfunctional. Right, that it doesn't get to the heart of things, and when it thinks it's got its hands on it, it lets things just slip away.
And that brings me to this question of profiteering, that the gentailers are being accused of profiteering.
Deputy Prime Minister Winston Peters, he told me that he knows profiteering is going on with New Zealand's big electricity generators.
What does that even mean?
I mean, profiteering was a term that was used during the war, wasn't it? It was people who were actually preying on large parts of the populace with high prices for scarce goods, and they were actually just taking advantage of the circumstances. When is a reasonable rate of return on your investment and maximising your earnings? When does it become profiteering?
Yeah.
Right? It depends, I think, what side of the divide you're on, whether you're earning or whether you're paying.
Mercury Energy Chief Executive Vince Hawksworth.
These businesses are massive businesses. So if you look at our large assets, then the profits that we make are in line with other businesses that are listed on the NZX. Our yields are not substantially different to what people get from putting their money in the bank.
When you talk about profiteering, the view is, and of course, that you step in, that you have to set a rate of return. Now, the Commerce Commission does set rates of return for companies who are in a monopoly position or with substantial market dominance in particular sectors. Broadband is one, so that the prices that Chorus can charge, for instance, are regulated in many circumstances. Lines companies are exactly the same. Similarly, it looks at Transpower and it says Transpower wants to upgrade the grid, national grid here, and put some more pylons there, and it regulates the amount of money that Transpower can invest in those. it's based on the rate of return and the costs. Are you going to do that with power companies? I'm not sure of that. And of course, the moment you get into regulating what is supposed to be a free market, and this is what it was all about, the market will rule, the market will set the price, and the market will be fair. Well, if you don't believe the market is fair, then the government has to be brave enough to set out some measures that will bring in the extra competition. Now, the Commerce Commission can do some studies on this, whether there's price gouging and that, but these things, as we've seen, for instance, in supermarkets and petrol companies, these things are hard to determine, and sometimes the outcomes don't deliver what consumers necessarily want.
Giles, what do you think is going to happen here? Is the government going to step in with something that's going to make a real difference?
I have to say that I have my doubts as to whether it can take any short-term measures that would deliver significant short-term relief. It will have to wield a big stick. It may well be it has to go back to a more fundamental view about the way the electricity market is currently structured. And it may be separation between retail and generation. But it could be, and they would be loath to be likened to doing this, but Labour put up a view some time ago suggesting that there should be a single state buyer, and that it would buy the generation from the power companies at a fair rate, matched to production with a profit margin, and then it, in turn, that state electricity company, would then sell to retailers. Now, all of that's going to take some time to achieve, even if anybody's contemplating it.
In the meantime, this spiky market's going to continue?
In all likelihood, it will do. It may be that they try and insert some price caps in there to ensure that perhaps prices don't spike too high. Remembering that the wholesale prices are a reflection of that last kilowatt of power production available for the demand that is there. So if there's more demand, and they're only wanting 10 kilowatts of power and there's only 3 kilowatts of supply, then the prices rise accordingly and it goes to the person willing to pay the highest.
So the big question for householders, will the record wholesale prices mean even bigger power bills? Here's John Harbert again.
The wholesale electricity market is where some of our largest manufacturers buy their electricity, and it's also where our retailers buy their electricity to then sell it on to households. What tends to happen is a lot of people reduce how much they buy out of the wholesale market and they take out a thing called a hedge, which is essentially a contract for we will buy X amount of electricity at a set price for usually 1 to 3 years. It's a lot of risk actually in taking a hedge because about 80% of the time you end up paying more for the electricity than if you'd just been exposed to the wholesale market. Certainly that's the case. So a lot of the retailers, I expect, have got some long-term hedges in place. So they may not be directly exposed to the really high wholesale prices we saw last week and we're continuing to see this week. But at some point, they do need to renew those hedges. And those hedges, when they go to renew them, will be very, very expensive. And at that point, you're going to see either... Well, the independent retailers can't suck it up. They will have to pass that on to their customers, and the large gentailers will have to pass some of that on to their customers as well. So these elevated wholesale prices will flow on to households. They're just not flowing on to households right now.
How much higher do you think it's going to go?
Well, I think if we take a step back and we look at how did we sort of get here, and it's the shortage of gas is sort of exacerbating the current situation. But how we got here is we're grappling with some of the difficult trade-offs inherent in increasing our reliance on highly intermittent renewable generation, primarily wind and solar. Now, we want more wind and solar generation because, that helps lower our emissions and for other reasons. But an efficient wind generation plant only makes electricity about 40% of the time. So, what's providing the electricity for the other 60% of the time? It's dark in New Zealand roughly half the time, more so obviously in winter. What's providing the electricity and when we don't have sunlight? So you need something that you can always fall back on in order to increase your reliance on wind and solar. And that's the global experience as well. And that tends to be, in New Zealand's case, we need to fall back on a bit of coal and a bit of gas. Now, we want to reduce our reliance on those over time. This is not a case for having a lot more of it, but we need to know it's there when the country needs that electricity. And that means you've got to build some of that thermal, we call it sort of firming, just to firm up the electricity system. You've got to build that generation, and you need to build a lot of distribution and transmission network as well. And that has a huge cost. So an estimate that was used by analysts at a conference earlier this year was the total costs of getting from where we are to our net zero by 2050 target just in the electricity sector is something in the magnitude of $300 billion. So to kind of translate that into a number that makes sense for people, that's around $500 a month for every household in the country, and you still need to pay for the electricity you actually use on top of that. So clearly that's not affordable for a lot of households. So we've got to figure out where's the trade-off. How renewable do we want to go relative to what many of the households in New Zealand can actually afford? And the situation we have now with a shortage of gas is really kind of bringing that difficult discussion forward.
What would be the worst case scenario? Would it be regular power cuts, blackouts?
It depends on whose perspective you have. I think from the perspective of our member, the worst case situation is you essentially deindustrialise New Zealand because companies either don't have access to reliable access to electricity, or the price is so high that they just can't afford to operate. So from the perspective of New Zealand being an export-led economy, the worst case scenario is we deindustrialise our manufacturing exporters, and the entire country becomes, vastly poorer than it is right now. And that obviously flows on to households because you lose, tens and tens of thousands of skilled, high-paid jobs, and that really impacts a lot of our provincial towns where a lot of these manufacturing companies have their bases close by, but it also impacts our cities as well because, the wealth of our country is built on fundamentally manufacturing, a lot of it agricultural and primary industries. So that's sort of a worst case scenario from that perspective. From the perspective of households, your worst case scenario is lots of households lose their income, which makes everything challenging, and also that they just can't afford to pay their electricity. So, the fundamental basics of life, warmth, shelter, being able to have a shower or a bath and cook your meals, your worst case scenario is that a lot of households have to make some really serious compromises on all of those things, which are just fundamental to a basic standard of living in New Zealand.
Are you optimistic, pessimistic?
To be honest, I think it's too early to say. I mean, we know the government's taking the current situation very seriously. Look, I imagine they're getting a lot of advice around things that they could do, and I'm sure they'll make some announcements in due course when they're ready to. So we'll certainly be waiting for that. But equally, I don't think there's a lot of confidence on our part that the industry left to its own devices is going to rectify this, because a lot of the issues that have contributed to getting us here have come through sort of the decisions of actions of the current players in the market. So I think we probably do need some sort of reset, and I think we're probably going to need the government to help with that, because I just don't have a lot of confidence that left to itself the market's going to fix this, because if it was up to the market to fix it, I think we've had extremely high elevated wholesale prices now for 6 years, and the system hasn't stepped up to fix it to date.
That's it for today. The Detail is a newsroom production supported by RNZ and NZ On Air. This episode was engineered by Jeremy Ansell and produced by Gwen McClure and Davina Zimmer. Thank you to John Harbord and Giles Beckford. I'm Sharon Brett Kelly. Ka kite.